on? Is this better? Sweet. Cool. So our panel today is about igniting passion through outreach and communication. We have a bunch of really cool panelists lined up. So to start things off, I'll let them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about what they do. So Marcia, if you want to start.
Hi, I'm Marcia Fiamengo, and I'm the founder of TouchSpace, which is a data-driven analytics company looking at how outreach impacts workforce development and communities around the world. I'm also a NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador, so I've been doing EPO for NASA for 17 years now. I'm older than I'd like to be. I started out as a nuclear engineer at Oregon State and did 5 years of microgravity research aboard the KC-135 and C-9B at NASA Johnson. I worked for the Vasimer Lab at Johnson for a while and then have bounced around through a bunch of different nonprofits related to space education and am now back in grad school eating ramen.
Oh my God, how can I follow that? My name is Sharon Hagle, and I'm a Virgin Galactic Future astronaut. I signed up in 2007. I live in Winter Park, Florida. And about 2.5 years ago, I started SpaceKids Global, a not-for-profit organization that mission is to inspire elementary students in STEAM plus education, particularly focusing on empowering young girls. We started the program focusing on 6 and 7-year-olds based on a lecture I heard from Michio Kaku. Dr. Kaku said, if you don't have kids hooked to math and science by 6 and 7, you've lost them. He motivated me, but it was Richard Branson who told me if your dreams don't frighten you, they're too small. So I hate public speaking, but as you can see, I am motivated to get my message out to get children inspired in STEAM.
I'm Chris Gebhardt. I'm the assistant managing editor for NASASpaceflight.com. I've been a spaceflight reporter for 10 years, but spaceflight has been in my blood since birth as a Florida native. I'm a graduate of Stetson University, where I studied English, communication, and rhetoric, as well as American cultural studies. So I don't actually hail from the engineering and technical side, although that is what NASA Spaceflight, that's our niche in the reporting industry. So I definitely come from the arts and humanities side of STEAM education.
Hi, my name is Emilee Speck. I'm with the CBS station in Orlando, WKMG, where I cover space exploration, planetary science, and a lot of breaking news. And before that, I was with the Orlando Sentinel, where I started the Go for Launch blog, where we cover space. And I went to the University of North Florida, studied journalism and photography. I'm a Florida native also. I grew up a couple miles from here, watching launches from my backyard. My father is a NASA engineer. That's kind of where I got this, but I am not an engineer, clearly. So, yeah, that's it.
Cool. So as you can see, we got a wide variety of perspectives, wide variety of backgrounds on this panel. So now that you've heard a little bit about that, be sure to direct your questions using Slido. You can feel free to direct them to a particular panelist as well. But to start things off, I'd like to kind of get to the core messages that you guys focus on and what really drew you guys to space. So if you can, in 1 or 2 sentences, explain why we should care about space, or more specifically, why you care about space.
1 or 2 sentences.
Yeah.
I think, like most people in this room, we could probably write a book about that. I wanted to be an astronaut since I was about 4 years old, and I didn't really understand what that was. And as I've learned and grown and gotten older, it's kind of evolved into an understanding and cognizance of space assets being able to be utilized for global good. And it's just not about putting humans in space. We have this great and wonderful viewpoint from out there, and translating that to people that are not interested in aerospace and don't see that as a big value. So, yeah.
I think I use space as a window so that I can open the doors and get young children excited about the opportunity of space exploration, and particularly being the next generation of future space travelers. I come into this industry with a different perspective. I'm a layperson. I'm an ordinary person. I have a real job. I do site selecting for national tenants throughout the U.S. If you see a McDonald's or a Brinker International, Chili's, in a certain area, that might be one of the sites I find. So for me to be looking at space is totally different. And I think it's important that we realize in the next generation that there's going to be an opportunity for everybody to go to space. I've had the opportunity to train with zero gravity over at Kennedy Space Center. I trained at NASTAR in Philadelphia with the NASA astronaut training program. In fact, I had the opportunity to meet Commander Chris Ferguson before his final flight. And then just recently, I completed 3 days in Star City, Russia, where we trained with the Russian cosmonauts.
For me, honestly, it's about the just sheer wonder and magnitude of what spaceflight can give us as a society and as a species as a whole, and the idea that the goal and the vision of space exploration is truly an international endeavor and one that we do together instead of on a nationalistic front now is largely what drives my passion, and that this idea that the word can't shouldn't be in our vocabulary at all when it comes to space exploration.
So I didn't go to journalism school to cover space. That wasn't even on my mind at all. But the first newsroom I worked in was in Florida, Naples Daily News. And I couldn't believe the lack of excitement within my own newsroom and the community as a whole when we would have launches. I just remember growing up as a kid, and it was just normal for us to go outside and watch a launch, either while you're at school or from your backyard, and having the windows rattle from that sonic boom when the shuttle returned. And so I was kind of shocked that there wasn't greater interest, and I realized that a lot of that interest left in 2011 after we stopped sending humans to space from the US. So it kind of became a goal that I had internalized and then was able to work on to keep spreading the message of space exploration, not only on the human front, but planetary science is so fascinating and it can be interesting to everyone. It doesn't matter if you have an engineering degree or you have a specialty, but it can be interesting. I mean, we just saw that a couple years ago with Pluto. That was such an amazing outreach for NASA and for science as a whole. So for me, it's just spreading those messages that I think normally wouldn't get to people. And I work for, the mainstream media, and I think that we should have those messages. They shouldn't have to try and find niche places to find them. I want to get it out there as much as possible. So that's where it comes from.
Cool. So kind of drawing on the idea of trying to communicate to as many people as possible. Can you touch on either an event that you were a part of or something that you've attended, like in terms of outreach, that was either very effective or very ineffective in communicating space to an audience? And what are some lessons that we can learn from those events? So this is for anyone, really.
So I would say that the most ineffective outreach that we've experienced in probably the last 25 years was March for Science. And I say that because it was cathartic in the sense that a lot of scientists and engineers and people that are science fans got together and could express how angry and frustrated we all were with the state of the state of understanding, general understanding of science, and how our political system has treated technological and scientific progress. It was a good opportunity for us to rage and pat ourselves on the back and call people that don't like science stupid and be condescending and snarky and celebrate that and revel in it. And it feels good. It feels really good. But the problem was we were alienating and further ostracizing people that we needed to convince that science is important. And it was incredibly disheartening to see the reaction. I came from a very rural community in the middle of nowhere in Eastern Oregon, and I grew up with a bunch of Hicks. And buck and bales and Rogan rye and everything that comes with living in a very dusty, drought-filled environment and trying to live a hardscrabble existence and pull your living and survival out of the land. That doesn't translate well when you have a perceived, very urban, very liberal population. And despite the fact that rural communities are very dependent upon not only science, but space assets as far as satellite imagery for erosion and crop damage mitigation, it has driven that divide in both rural and conservative America even further. Aerospace in general is very lucky in that we have DoD and some resonance with conservative communities as far as the importance of a strong military and using space for military assets. But March for Science destroyed a lot of goodwill that people had individually tried to bring to conservative communities. And so if there's one thing that I could communicate the importance of outreach is that you're no better than anybody else on this planet. You're not special, you're not a snowflake. And when you start thinking that, it dehumanizes you and it dehumanizes everybody that you're trying to convince how important your work is. You have to meet them on their level. And sometimes that's tough and sometimes it's frustrating. And I'm looking at a room full of extremely smart people. And with, as Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility. It's up to you guys and you women to sit there and find a way to better communicate the importance of spaceflight to communities that aren't fun to talk to, that are going to ask you rude questions and challenge your very idea of why what you're doing is more important than any other industry in the world. So try not to take the easy route. Try not to sit there and talk to people that you're going to respond positively to you and are going to allow you to have that feel-good little snark fest about how stupid people can be. There are groups that you're never going to convince. I would suggest that the Flat Earther movement might be one of those. But when we denigrate people for their opinions, especially when they're non-scientific opinions, and don't take the time to ardently listen to what they have to say and then come back with thought-provoking questions for them in a respectful manner, we lose, and we lose big. And March for Science was a lesson to for our community at large to kind of take to heart and say, we can do better.
Okay, one thing that I would add to that, I don't have a specific event or anything that I didn't think went well. I just have a little bit of advice about for you guys going into your future fields or your current fields. Become friends with your communications officers. Let them know when you're doing something really cool and help them get that message out, because those end up being the people that reach out to me or Chris and will give us those story pitches. And if you can pitch a good story to them and explain to them why it's really cool, then they'll get you in front of us for those interviews. And if you can learn to communicate about your science or your missions, then it's a much better story, because having me explain something is fine, but it's not my project. It's not, my life's work. So becoming a good communicator and working with those people who can kind of teach you those skills just right off the bat is an important part. So.
And to that end too, like talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, talk to your girlfriends, your boyfriends who aren't in the same field as you, right? Let them know what excites you about the projects that you're working on, to the extent that you can talk about the projects. I mean, don't go blabbing classified information. That's not good, but the more you can show people why you're excited, the easier it is for that excitement to come across in interviews, like what Emilee was talking about how we can disseminate that information. The more excited you are about a project, and excited you are to talk to us about, the more engaging it is and easier it is for us to turn around and let the general public know why they should care and why it's exciting and why it's going to matter to them.
Well, and I think one of the, to piggyback off of that, part of this whole process is selling your brand and storytelling. And I think there's an intrinsic part of being an engineer or a scientist where you kind of eschew anything that's necessarily personal promotion because it doesn't feel right. But that's how we get the message across. That's how we talk to different things. So you have to, in order to bridge that gap between pure science and engineering and the quantitative analysis to a qualitative communication, people want to hear about your personal story. They want to hear about why you're excited about it in an abstract manner or in a personal manner. And that's one of the things that I've learned, especially from talking to Sharon. Sharon comes from outside the industry, and she deals with people that have no connection with aerospace at all, and she's still able to talk to them.
Well, and that leads into one of the situations that I had recently while presenting at Brown Academy in Alexandria, Virginia. We had a classroom, I think they were first and second graders, and at the end, the parents came up to me the next day and said, "My son never talks about what goes on at school." Now remember, these are little people, they're audiences, they're just beginning their journey. He says, "My son never talks about what goes on in school. He came running into the house last night and he says, 'Mom, Dad,' he says, 'an astronaut came to our school and I got to talk to her.'" That's exciting. Girls come up to me and say, "Can I be an astronaut?" Of course you can. Space is big, it's for everybody. You just have to have the passion and have the initiative to step forward. Another thing we talk about is life is full of surprises. I never expected to be able to go to space, but here I am. I have an opportunity, and we're opening the doors for the rest of the planet. Soon, a ticket to space will be just like buying a ticket to on an airline at an airport. We're developing spaceports now throughout the country, and I think it's going to be a really exciting time in the next 2 or 3 years.
So kind of going off that, something that Marcia said, this is the top question on Slido right now, but it's what do you think about a government who is continuously becoming more anti-science? So first of all, do you think that the government is becoming more anti-science? And then also, what do you think about it? How do we deal with it?
That's a really good question, and I think it's kind of everybody in the science community and in engineering and industry is really concerned about this. And I would say that that part of the responsibility lays with us as individuals. I'm registered as an independent, and I was talking to one of my friends that's a community organizer for the Democratic Party in Sacramento. California is obviously a very, very liberal state. And he was asking me, what changed my mind, why I decided to register independent. And I said I was so frustrated with the way the Democratic Party is running things, and I was really irritated with it, and I felt disenfranchised. And he said, "Well, why don't you do something about it?" And I looked at him, and I didn't have a good response, because why am I not doing something about it? This is something I'm upset about, I care deeply about, and yet I'm just going to sit here and complain. And that's something that I spent my entire career doing education, public outreach related to science, and I still hadn't transitioned into that mentality in other areas of my life. But it's our responsibility as individual citizens to speak up about things that we care about, and one of those, if that's science, and it should be, you gotta speak up. And what Chris said about talking to your friends and family and neighbors, that's very important. You need to be an ambassador for tech, for science, for aerospace. And the other thing is call your legislators. You don't need to talk to and even on the state level, you don't need to talk to like McCain or anybody in specific. You need to talk to the staffers. And because ultimately 9/10 of the legislation that gets put up on the Hill is created by the staffers and the office itself. And you call enough times, you develop a relationship with them. Just call, don't be antagonistic. You can just clearly state your message, take 5 minutes of their time, state what you do, how you impact your state, and move on. But you have to generate that relationship, and you have to communicate to people. So the ultimate goal is that science becomes normalized. And right now we've successfully isolated ourselves, and we've said, it's difficult talking to people that don't understand science, so we're just going to talk to ourselves. So go out there, and if you're at all inclined, I really encourage you to do this. There are not enough people that are in tech and science and engineering and aerospace that actually work as staffers on the Hill. You can do a 6-month rotation. You can go volunteer with an office with a particular campaign, and I really encourage you to not talk to the people whose party you're affiliated with. If you're not affiliated with a political party, even better, but go talk to Republicans if you're a Democrat. If you're a Democrat or if you're a Republican, go talk to Democrats. Talk to people that are on the opposing side. You're going to make the most impact that way, because people understand that if you're talking to them, you care, and you care about them. And that's all we want at the end of the day, is somebody to care about us, right?
I always think that bringing this back to real world, because that's great, right? And that type of outreach is exactly what is needed. And I would say we need to go a step further with that. Is we need to understand some of the real world implications to what's been going on. And the real world implication I just want to offer as my answer to this, dates back to stuff that the government has been doing in terms of cutting funding for years, not just the current administration or the current Congress, but going back decades. And that is weather forecasting. So how many of you in some way, whether it was friend, family, yourself, where you grew up, how many people in this room were affected in some way by either Hurricane Harvey, Irma, or Maria this year? And how many of us here were panicking, who were affected by those storms, were panicking because the weather forecasters had no idea where those storms were going to go 3 days out? That is a very real world impact to the cutting of science funding that we have seen, right? And after Irma hit, what we saw instantly was a bunch of organizations here in the United States and the National Hurricane Center start to ignore the US-based forecasting models and only use the European forecasting models, because the European models had it bang on for every single one of those storms. So find some way when you're making arguments, whether it's about science funding, whether it's about the field that you're going into, find that very real and concrete way that everyone can be affected by it, and use that as part of the conversation that you have with others of why this type of funding and why this type of research is vital to us.
Yeah, I think that was a great point. I think one of the things, specifically for Chris and Emilee, you guys, as people who work in media and report, right, you have to communicate not just the things that directly affect people and people can look at, that's Hurricane Harvey, that's Hurricane Irma, but also other developments in the space industry that may not necessarily have any impact that you can draw on immediately to convince someone from the general public. So how do you go about finding that balance between describing new discoveries and making them exciting to people, but also preserving some of that scientific rigor and intent within it?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Okay, I'm going to say a phrase, and then I'm going to ask 3 questions. And the questions are going to be, who has absolutely no idea what I said, who has a vague idea of what I said, and who knows exactly what I said. So, Flight 1039 FCC STA. Who has no idea what I just said, the meaning behind it? Who has a vague idea of what I might be talking about? And who knows definitely what I'm talking about? Look around the room. Not one person, and you are the audience for this, right? All right. What that actually is, that's the Falcon 9 flight that's sitting on pad 39A right now, about to launch Zuma, and that is the Federal Communications, for lack of a better term, launch license that is granted for the communication frequencies that the rocket will use for launch and landing. Now, in the article that I wrote that's on my site right now, I called it a launch license because somehow saying it's a special temporary authority doesn't quite convey what it is in reality. Well, I could read you the 3-page email that I got this morning from someone going, well, you called it a launch license, but it's technically a special temporary authority, and I understand what you... seriously, right? So where do you draw the line? Okay, so, you know, this business in all realms of science, right, specifically spaceflight, is known for its love for acronyms and, you know, some really complicated things, especially when you start talking about planetary science and astrophysics. So, you know, you have a responsibility to adhere to the facts, right? Like, it wouldn't be right to say that the Air Force granted SpaceX a launch license, right? You know, there are some things you can't get wrong, right, and that are very obvious. But then you really have to stop and think of what's the best way that everyone reading this article is going to know instantly what is meant by this, right? So, you know, that's a more recent funny example because it happened to me when I was driving here this morning. But you know, this is a conversation that's taking place within our community right now, especially in the last month with the gravity wave discovery, where someone who was assigned, who wasn't a space person, had no interest in space, that's how she opened the article, talked about how she was given this assignment to talk about gravity waves and she didn't understand it. And what the piece became was all the ways that Emilee and I and everyone in our profession gets the outreach to everyone else completely and utterly wrong, and how we're complete failures because we don't communicate the excitement behind all of these discoveries. But it's really hard to tell Sally and Joe living down the street why gravity waves are important, you know, like, but it's easier, right, to instill that sense of excitement and why is this important when you talk about why, you know, the RTLS landing of the Falcon 9, hopefully tonight, is a big deal for the space community, right? There's something very quantifiable about saying the recovery will allow the next customer to use that, whether it's a commercial company or a government agency. It's going to provide them a discount. It's going to give greater schedule reliance. It's going to do all these things, right? It's easier to do that when there's a very tangible thing that you can explain to them. So whenever it's possible for those tangible things, you take it and you do it. And the intangible things, you honestly just kind of have to do your best and then listen to what the feedback is from people and understand what you did wrong and where your areas of improvement could be.
Yeah. Basically everything Chris just said, yes, all of that. Another thing that I'll add to that, and I guess I'll go back to gravitational waves, is a little bit of a funny story is when the first announcement was made that they detected gravitational waves, I was at the Sentinel and I was in a news meeting and surrounded by people who were like, so what? What is the big deal? And I said, I will convince you that this story needs to go on A1. And then I was like, oh crap, why did I just say that? Because I don't know if I can actually convince them that this story should go on A1. So then for the rest of the day, I even had 3 hours to get something by deadline. And I ended up calling a local physicist and saying, okay, I need props. I need a way to explain this via props to our managing editor so that he will put this story on A1. And he gave me a very vague balloon reference. So then, of course, they made me shoot a video where I'm squeezing a balloon trying to explain gravitational waves. That's a very poor example of gravitational waves. But however, I won and I got it on A1, so that's exciting. But every time I pitch a story it's complicated, I always think about it in my head first. Okay, so how am I going to pitch this to an editor? How am I going to pitch this to our news director that this, needs to be in our 11 p.m.? How am I going to get this in front of as many people as possible? And sometimes it's just breaking it down to basic language, talking about, okay, solar arrays. What's a solar array? A solar panel. Like, just just say it in non-NASA speak. You know, I mean, it's easy, and oftentimes I've explained things to my coworkers using props on my desk with staplers and things, just so that they understand what's going on, and then they're like, "Oh, now I get it." So just break it down. I mean, that's what we're always trying to do, and sometimes I think we do a pretty bang-up job of that. I've used food analogies. I've used everything you can think of to break science down, and sometimes it comes across great, and people are able to get it, and sometimes not so much. But I will never say that science is boring, and I feel like that's what happened last month with that. We felt like, you know, we were failing for, you know, not being able to explain things to this one person, but we're not going to be able to explain it to everyone. It's our audience is not always going to, it's not going to be a light bulb for everyone every single time, and we know that, but for those that we do get, that's great. So let's make it easier for them. And, you know, I'm not going to say dumb it down, but just talk like a person, you know, and anytime you guys can do that, makes it so much more helpful. So, yeah.
And you know, I would also add to that, you know, like we each have different audiences that we're aiming for, right? My audience is a much more technical community than the one Emilee is aiming for, and you know, especially with the Zuma mission, one thing that I've been very happy to see is, you know, our site and myself, we reported on a lot of the technical aspects about how we discovered the mission, you know, to the extent of what we know what it is and what the Falcon 9 is going to do, and I'm more than happy to, you know, have someone from The Verge or The Observer or the local CBS station pick that up and say, hey, if you want to know the nuts and bolts, go read this article. I'm going to continue that conversation and tell you something else that their publication doesn't include because it's not for their audience. You know, there's a lot, I think in our business, there's a lot of like, no, it's mine, it's my story, instead of you know, how can we work together and link between each other's work to help present the full story in ways that satisfies our various audiences.
Yeah, I think the main theme throughout what both of you were saying the entire time was always know your audience and know how to address them. And so I'm interested for you, Marcia, and you, Sharon, in your line of work, it's definitely not the same as, you know, broadcasting, but you still have to interact with different audiences and be able to convince different people that, you know, space is important, whether that's children, adults, their parents, or whoever. So how has that kind of played a role in your work and how you plan your outreach?
So there's a component of outreach that's super easy, and that's being passionate about it. And that's a very critical component of the outreach is your excitement and your willingness to talk about a certain subject. So let yourself go. Be excited, be happy, and that's one of the most important ways to engage an audience. But there's another side that requires intuition but isn't necessarily intuitive to begin with, and it's a realization that you have a very distinct way of communicating and you have a distinct passion about certain topics, and maybe that doesn't translate to every audience that you're going to see. So you have to step back and say, okay, what's my goal? Is my goal to promote and talk about what I do, or is my goal to encourage people to think that this general subject matter is important? And there are different audiences for that. If you're going to talk to on a high level or do a deep dive with any particular group, if that's postgrads, if that's, you know, industry, you probably want to be technical, and you want to demonstrate your breadth of knowledge in a subject. But if you're talking to kindergarten through third graders, or you're talking to a Rotary Club or a 4-H club or local business leaders, you want to look at it, sit down and look at what they would want to know. And sometimes that can get really specific for an audience, and sometimes it can be fairly general, and you can cycle through the same stuff that you say, you know, to other folks. But really take a good solid hour before you write your PowerPoint or before you recycle stuff to think about what is going to benefit that audience and what the audience thinks is going to benefit them. And sometimes that's tough, and you're not going to be successful all of the time, but put yourself in their shoes and think about what they want to listen to before you get there. Preaching to the choir is easy, and you don't want you don't want to be talking to the choir all the time.
Well, I got involved in space when when I read accidentally the Global Educational Index, which the U.S. used to be in the top 5 in the world. And does anybody want to guess where we are today? 39th. And I just felt that I couldn't sit back and take a trip to space without giving back and trying to excite the younger generation, the elementary students that we go and visit. Our program is a 30-minute visual presentation tour. We show what other students around the world are doing in different countries. We share our message with the children. We ask them to, while we're there, to think what their mission is, what they can do to make the world a better place, and how can they make a difference in the world. And we use that throughout our theme just to get them to really take a look and step back and be aware of these things. We had a situation where the Minister of Defense from the United Kingdom called a couple months ago, just to let you know this STEAM problem is not just an American problem, it's a worldwide problem. And he called and he said, is there some type of program that you can do for us here in the UK? We are now in the process of doing a video that can be reached through our website. We're having it in English and Spanish. I think it's very important that we reach children at this age and just open the door to possibilities.
I have a quick question for you guys, just by show of hands. How many of you have done an outreach in the last 6 months? How many have done an outreach to K through 3 ever? How many have done an outreach to a non-traditional community organization? Okay, so I'm super excited that you guys are doing outreach. That's awesome. You should be doing it. You need to think about those two groups. Those are going to be the two biggest groups that you're going to convince people. Sharon was talking about her experience at Brown Academy in Virginia, and the kids coming home and talking about space. K through 3, it's really, they're insufferably happy and excited about stuff. And when you're a parent or you're an aunt or you're a family member, seeing them get so excited about a particular activity is actually kind of motivating. And you tend to engage more with your child or your relative based on that. So it actually, you wouldn't think that K through 3 would be a big marketing influence, but it is huge in communities. The other thing is when you go talk to a non-traditional community group like we'll just use a Rotary Club as a great example. You're talking to people that are very invested in their community and very engaged with it. And so if you can bridge that gap and show them why your work and what you're passionate about is important to the community, you're going to really, really help the development of aerospace and whatever your particular specialty is as far as community knowledge of it.
And when you do those outreaches, no matter if it's to a school or just community, call local media, right? Call the TV stations, call, yeah. call the local TV stations, call the local newspapers. Even if you make 10 calls to local media agencies and only one person shows up, someone's going to read that report or someone's going to see that piece that gets filed on it, and that will help, spread that message even further.
Emilee was talking about props. Sharon has the best prop.
No, you have to know your audience. That's what Marcia said. So my audience is anywhere from pre-K to 5th grade. So we use Google Earth to kind of show them how high space is by zooming into the street level at their school and then going up to commercial flights, the stratosphere, and then we end up at the ISS and looking back, and they get to see what it looks like looking back on the Earth. But the star of the show is always Saba, our little space dog. And we go and we talk to them about everybody has to have a flight suit, everybody has to represent their country. He has a little mini flag. We explain that the patches and the wings are completing our training programs. So he has, I don't know if you can see it, but math and science. But know your audience.
Apparently this translates well from kindergartners to everyone.
So I think that's it for the questions I had planned. I think we'll transition more to some of the audience questions that people have been asking on Slido. Someone actually asked about your dog, so I guess we covered that one.
That's always the question.
It's always going to be a question. Let's see. Cool. So here's one that I think is any of you can answer. Sydney says, as an engineer, I noticed a huge lack of diversity on the technical side of the industry. To what degree does that carry over to your side of the industry? And I think that applies to all four of you, both in scientific reporting as well as in just general space outreach. So if any of you have any comments you want to make.
Yeah, so this has been an interesting year for me. It's my last year as a young professional, so I'm about to hit the big old mark, which is 36 instead of 40 now. It's okay, Sharon. You're still 36.
No,
So-
I'm a leap year.
You're a leap year. Okay. So when I was going through as an undergraduate, I definitely I went to Oregon State University, which is Corvallis, the Beavers, not the Ducks. We were still at the 1 in 10, which is 1 out of every 10 engineers is female, and it was so we were looking at it with such concern that the lack of female representativeship in engineering and sciences, we hadn't even gotten to minority representation yet. And so this last year, I think I kind of blithely went through my career not paying attention and still recognizing that there were not as many women at conferences. I got to say, of all the aerospace conferences I've been to in the last year, which is too many, this has the most women at it. So I'm really grateful to see that representation in the audience today. The problem is that I'm discovering this year that numbers aren't necessarily any better for people entering that. And what's even more important is the drop-off rate of women and minorities in science and engineering is still huge. So as a result, you're getting through to mid-career and it's looking is significantly less diverse. And we talk a lot about diversity for a number of different reasons, but thinking from an engineering background, the importance of having people coming from different backgrounds to work on your team is incredibly important. You've got different life experiences that help you solve a number of different problems, and so it's something that we're losing people, but we aren't gaining the interest intrinsically in the first place. And part of it is the fact that we tend to be very communicative about the negative aspects, the sexism, and the bigotry that we experience in the workplace. And sometimes that's a good warning of what you're going to expect, but I've been trying to be a little bit more positive this year, and I want to talk more about the people that have supported me, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed white guys that are tall and super fit that have stood behind me and stood and supported me and other women and other minorities, not to a detriment of their own careers in a negative manner at all. That the vast majority of people are kind and generous and can be competitive, but also engage with their team. So that encouragement is necessary to translate down to the very early ages. There's a study that came out from the UK that was looking at 5-year-old girls versus 6-year-old girls, and it was the same study group. And at the beginning of the year, of the school year, the 5-year-olds, both boys and girls, expressed great confidence in either gender's ability to or enjoyment of math and science. 1 year later, just 1 year, between ages 5 and 6, a good 40% of the girls had lost confidence in their ability or their interest in science. And that's devastating. And that's not a lack of classroom training. It's just you look at societal issues and pressures already from that age, the continual, giving little boys trucks and giving little girls dolls. It's pervasive. I mean, you go to any store, like department store out there, and you're going to see that. Go to Amazon even. It's very marketed, like gender bias. So what I try to do when I go in for outreach, I know this is long. Sorry, I'll be quiet in a second. What I try to go do and go in for outreach, especially when I'm doing those early ages, is not make a difference, not segregate or particularly praise or overly overwhelm girls, because I think there's a backlash effect. And the point is that you select and you communicate with a variety of kids and you demonstrate their capability and their interest in the subject. The important thing for young people to understand is that they've all got different strengths and talents and they can work together. But when you promote one gender over the other in a group situation like that, it kind of reinforces the idea that there's either something wrong that needs to be addressed, and kids don't understand that. So I do think there's a definite place for things like Sally Ride Science, which allows young girls that maybe have felt disenfranchised from science and mathematics to get involved with that, and it gives them a safe space. But if you start from a very early age communicating to the entire group that each and every one of them are going to experience science and math in their lives, I think that's really critical.
I just want to add to that from the journalism standpoint. A real life example, Chris and I were just talking about this. So if you're covering a launch, you'll be at the Kennedy Space Center press site. Typically, there are 1 to 3 women, I would say, covering every launch. And I know yesterday, I think you said there was like 1 photographer out of 25 that was a woman. And this is a problem because we need women communicating about science, because then it also makes women want to be involved in science. Something I'm trying to do about that is whenever I meet a young journalist, I'm like, hey, come to the press site, apply for your credentials, let's go cover a launch together. I've tried and failed several times to get people out, but it's, I'll continue to try until I find someone who's interested. But I would love it if there are more women at the press site. I don't always get to be there if I get called away to breaking news, and sometimes it's an hour away, but I write about every single launch. And, another example of this that I've told this story multiple times, and every time it drives me nuts. The first week I started at the station, I had a coworker that was introduced to me, and our news director said, oh, this is Emilee. She's going to write about space. She, covers launches and things. And someone said to my face, oh, well, you don't look like a space reporter. I don't know what a space reporter is supposed to look like, but I'm it. So, and to that I said, well, okay, what does a space reporter look like? And he didn't have anything to say to that. So, and I know what he meant. He meant, I'm not a man, I'm not, I don't have a pocket protector, and I just look like I can make rockets on my own. I don't know. But let's change that narrative. And we also have a diversity problem at the press site. And that's one thing our friend Robin, who was supposed to be here, who writes for Wired, among other publications, he jokes that he's typically the only person of color ever at the site, and it's usually true. So we need to not only preach about getting diverse sources, which is another thing that I try and do, is when I'm speaking to universities or looking for sources, I'm always saying, hey, where are the ladies at? You're giving me the same white guy to talk to, and I love to talk to him, but I know you have other people that could talk about this issue, and I want to hear from them too. We need diverse voices telling stories and then writing about them. So that's my soapbox. So
I think Marcy really hit on it. It's the isolation. My husband and I are involved with Purdue University, and one of the things they talk about the engineering department is it's 1 out of 10 for females. And even after graduation, the longevity of that position with females is usually about a year because of the isolation. And I think your generation has an opportunity to change that. I know when we work with Purdue for scholarships in STEAM education, we call it STEAM Plus. We have the A for the arts, and we also add the environment, because we all have to live here. But we ask the students, they have to graduate in a STEAM field. They have to be a member of the Purdue Marching Band, because my husband was a drummer. But more importantly, they have to pay it forward. And I think your generation has an opportunity to do that, to reach out, help someone, don't isolate them. You can be a big part in making a change in history, especially the space exploration.
I just want to acknowledge something really fast, is that we're all white. And as a woman that's gone through engineering, I understand how that works. I don't know what it's like to be a minority in science and engineering, and I know that it's tough and it's a completely different set of challenges. And when you're putting together conference stuff, Samaya and Yash have done you guys should look into it. But one of the things they have is this breakout session where everybody divides into groups based on subject, like not necessarily subject matter, but ultimate career goal, and they have mentors. Well, and the mentors are always great, but last year there were 5 mentors, and they were all old white men. And that's okay. They were great expert, things, but this is an international conference, and you have 5 American white men that don't have a personal perspective on, doing their jobs, but also having some sort of understanding, deeper understanding of the complexities that some of us face going through the aerospace field. So they all did a great job, and they were fantastic. I got to work with the chief engineer from Northrop Grumman on JWST, John Ehrenberg. If you have a chance to talk to him, he's fantastic, and he was very. I don't want to say apologetic, but very much recognize that. And it's a different set of experiences. Everybody brings something to the table, and it's good to see that. So take some personal responsibility, and it doesn't matter if you're a minority or a woman or you're just a supporter and ally. Say, hey, maybe next time can we try to diversify the group a little bit more? And it was weird to me because when I brought it up to SGAC, there was an immediate pushback because you feel defensive. You put together this project or whatever, and when somebody criticizes you, even if it's trying to be constructive, it's hard. It's hard to hear. So don't take it personally, and just try to be like, okay, next time maybe that's something that I need to think about a little bit more. But everybody brings a different perspective, and it's great to include more people.
Kind of on a different line. Oh, are we done? One more question? Oh gosh, gotta make a good one. Let's see. Yeah. So a quick question. Heather asked, what media types and platforms are you most excited about, or do you think will be the most valuable in doing public outreach and communication going forward? So we can just go down the panel and
There you go, Chris.
say anything you want.
There you go, Chris.
In terms of right now, I find Twitter to be a fantastic medium for getting information out very, very quickly, and getting that engagement. I know, for me personally, like if anyone asks me a question about anything on Twitter, like if I don't know the answer off the top of my head, like I will go find it and I will go answer that question for them. So I think that's a really good way of, that sort of instant communication of what's going on. One thing I would personally really love to see, and it's something that anyway, I would love to see it, but I admit that I am one of the people who doesn't do it. I would love to see reporting become much more multimedia. It's still either just print or watch this video clip of what happened. I would really love to see a proliferation of the merging of those two, because there's a lot to be said for what video can do to augment, excitement on the page. Because I can write, this is really important because, but if you're reading that, you could read it as, this is really important because. But if I'm standing up and going, my gosh, come on, you got to understand this, that enthusiasm can really come through video. So I'd like to see a merging of those two.
As far as types of media go, we see a pretty good response with Snapchat. Whenever I go cover a launch and I use Snapchat, we usually get a lot of people responding to our station account saying, what's this? I snap like the VAB, and they're like, what's that building? I'm like, well, it's kind of important, and then that creates a conversation. Or if they get to ask, I want to read more about that. So it doesn't really get us page views or, a lot. There's not too much to gain from that except for interest, and hopefully they'll go to clickorlando.com/space and read about it. So that's one area that we've seen. But as far as multimedia goes, yes, like video and text go hand in hand. Showing something is sometimes so much more efficient than explaining it with words. I know a great example of that is the solar eclipse that we recently just experienced. My coworker Shannon and I road trip to Idaho, and video was really, really important, capturing those reactions. People who ask me, what was it like? I'm like, watch this video. Because it's just, even though I wrote about it, it's just, it's hard to explain. Sometimes it's good not to have words for things. Yeah.
I'd like to add to that. I think General Electric is doing a fantastic job with their commercials now. Have you guys seen
yeah.
Inspiring Molly?
Yeah.
And what if scientists were treated like rock stars?
Yeah.
I mean, kudos.
Yeah.
I would say.
I think we're out of time.
Okay.
But if you are curious to hear what Marcia had to say, you can talk to her after. We also had a lot of questions in the Slido that we didn't get a chance to respond to. So definitely go talk to these panelists afterwards, get their opinions on these topics because they're all very experienced in their fields. So thank you guys so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed the panel.
You did a great job.